Buried desert fortune. Loretta Boone had always lived by the law, but when Colt Dawson, a wanted man with a past tangled in hers, landed in her jail, she knew justice wasn't always so simple. He leaned against the bars, his smirk slow and knowing. "You gonna keep me locked up, Sheriff?" he murmured. "Or are you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Chapter 1. The Badge and the Burden. The weight of the badge felt heavier than usual today, a cold, unyielding circle of metal pressing against Loretta Boone's chest. Sheriff Loretta Boone. It had been her father's badge, and his father's before him. A legacy of law in a land that often scoffed at such notions. Dust devils danced across the parched main street of Redemption, Arizona, swirling around the worn wooden sign that creaked above her office door, Sheriff's Office. Justice served. Justice. A word that tasted like ash in her mouth these days. Loretta adjusted her Stetson, the late afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and warped the familiar buildings of her town. The saloon, the rusty spur, was already spilling out the raucous sounds of laughter and clinking glasses, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of her office. Inside, the scent of old wood, gun oil, and stale coffee clung to the air, a familiar comfort. Yet today, it felt suffocating. She ran a calloused hand over the smooth, worn surface of her desk, tracing the intricate carvings her grandfather had etched into the wood, a sprawling landscape of mesas and canyons, a miniature representation of the vast, unforgiving territory she was sworn to protect. Her fingers lingered on a small, almost imperceptible nick, a mark left by a stray bullet during a shootout years ago, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond the thin veneer of civilization. Loretta was 57, her face a roadmap of hard-won battles and quiet sorrows, etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and sleepless nights. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, held a weariness that belied her unwavering resolve. Strands of gray were starting to weave their way through her auburn hair, usually pulled back in a tight braid, but today, a few rebellious strands had escaped, framing her face in a soft halo. She wore a simple, practical dress, covered by a worn leather vest, the sheriff's star glinting prominently. The rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound in the otherwise silent office. It was a sound that usually soothed her, a steady pulse in the chaotic rhythm of frontier life. But today, it felt like a countdown, each tick echoing the growing unease that had settled in her gut. She glanced at the wanted poster tacked to the wall, the faded ink barely concealing the strong, defiant features of the man staring back at her. Colt Dawson. The name itself sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of dread and something else, something she couldn't quite name, a feeling buried deep beneath years of duty and self-imposed restraint. Colt Dawson. A ghost from her past, a shadow that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. A man she had once loved, a man she had believed in, a man who had betrayed her, and the law, in one fell swoop. A man who is now, inexplicably, sitting in her jail cell, his presence a storm brewing on her horizon. He had ridden into town just an hour ago, as bold as brass, his arrival as unexpected as a desert flash flood. No posse, no dramatic entrance, just Colt, astride his magnificent black stallion, Diablo, walking into her office with that infuriating, slow smirk playing on his lips. The years had been kind to him, if kind meant adding a layer of ruggedness to his already striking features. His dark hair was longer now, streaked with silver at the temples, framing a face that was leaner, harder, etched with the same lines of experience that marked her own. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, still held that same unsettling intensity, that spark of wildness that had both captivated and terrified her all those years ago. He hadn't resisted arrest. He hadn't even flinched when she'd drawn her Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight of it a comfort in her trembling hand. He had simply dismounted, handed her the reins to Diablo, and walked into the jail cell, the metal door clanging shut behind him with a resounding finality that echoed the closing of a chapter in her life she thought she had long since finished. "You gonna keep me locked up, Sheriff?" He had murmured, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. He leaned against the bars, his smirk slow and knowing, his eyes locking with hers, holding her captive in their intense gaze. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, with the weight of years of silence and regret. Loretta had stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, resentment, and yes, a flicker of that old, familiar flame she had tried so desperately to extinguish. She hadn't answered him. She had simply turned away, her back stiff, her shoulders rigid, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. She had walked back to her desk, the weight of the badge feeling heavier than ever, the burden of her duty pressing down on her, a suffocating weight. Now, sitting at her desk, the wanted poster a stark reminder of the situation she faced, Loretta felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Colt Dawson was a wanted man. He had a price on his head, a long list of alleged crimes trailing behind him like a dust cloud. Robbery, rustling, even murder. The evidence was circumstantial, she knew, but it was enough. Enough to keep him locked up, enough to send him to the gallows. But it wasn't that simple. It had never been that simple with Colt. He had always existed in that gray area between right and wrong, between law and outlaw, a complex tapestry of light and shadow. And she, the woman sworn to uphold the law, had always been drawn to that shadow, to the dangerous allure of the forbidden. Loretta stood up, the sudden movement making her chair scrape against the wooden floor. She walked over to the window, her gaze fixed on the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple. A breathtaking spectacle, a reminder of the beauty that still existed in this harsh, unforgiving land. But tonight, even the beauty of the sunset couldn't soothe the turmoil raging within her. She had a decision to make. A decision that could cost her everything. Her career, her reputation, her peace of mind. But more than that, it was a decision that could cost her soul. Could she uphold the law, the oath she had sworn to protect, and send the man she had once loved to his death? Or could she listen to that small, insistent voice in her heart, the voice that whispered of second chances, of redemption, of a love that had never truly died? The sound of a chair scraping against the floor in the cell block startled her. She turned, her hand instinctively going to the Colt peacemaker at her hip. Colt was standing at the bars, his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. The decision, she knew, was no longer hers alone. It was a dance between two souls, a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. And it was about to begin. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The kerosene lamp on Loretta's desk hissed softly, casting a flickering, amber glow that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. The silence in the office was thick, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant, muffled sounds of revelry from the rusty spur. Loretta remained by the window, her back to Colt, her silhouette a stark outline against the fading light. "Why, Colt?" Her voice was low, barely a whisper, the words heavy with the weight of years of unanswered questions. "Why did you come back?" He didn't answer immediately. She could hear the soft rasp of his boots against the stone floor of the cell as he shifted his weight. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "Redemption," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the quiet room. "It's in the name, isn't it? A man comes back to a place like this looking for something." Loretta turned, slowly, her eyes meeting his across the dimly lit space. The years had etched lines of hardship around his eyes, but they hadn't diminished their intensity. They still held that same captivating glimmer, that hint of danger that had always drawn her in. "And what is it you're looking for, Colt? Redemption? Or something else?" He chuckled, a low, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Maybe a little of both, Sheriff. Maybe I'm tired of running. Maybe I'm tired of the shadows. Shadows. The word hung in the air between them, a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the darkness that had enveloped both their lives. 15 years ago, they had been young, idealistic, full of dreams. Loretta, the newly appointed deputy, eager to prove herself in a man's world, and Colt, the charming, rebellious ranch hand, working on her father's sprawling spread, the Double Bar Ranch. They had fallen in love quickly, fiercely, their passion as wild and untamed as the land that surrounded them. It was a love born of stolen moments, whispered promises under the vast, starlit sky, a love that had felt as inevitable as the sunrise. But it was also a love doomed from the start. Her father, the stern, unyielding Sheriff Thomas Boone, had disapproved of Colt, seeing him as nothing more than a troublemaker, a threat to his daughter's future, to the legacy of law he had built. The shadows had started to creep in then, subtly at first, whispers of Colt's involvement in petty thefts, rumors of his association with a notorious gang of cattle rustlers. Loretta had refused to believe it, her faith in Colt unwavering, her love blinding her to the growing evidence. Then had come the night that had shattered everything. A robbery at the town's bank, a botched escape, and a deputy shot dead. The evidence had pointed to Colt, his distinctive silver-handled revolver found at the scene, his horse seen fleeing into the night. Loretta had been devastated, her world crumbling around her, her heart torn between her duty to the law and her love for the man she believed innocent. Colt had vanished, disappearing into the vast wilderness, leaving Loretta to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, to face the scorn and pity of the town, to carry the burden of his betrayal. She had taken up her father's badge after he died a year later, a broken man, his spirit crushed by the scandal. She had sworn to uphold the law, to bring Colt to justice, to erase the stain he had left on her family's name. And now, here he was, back in her life, back in her jail, his presence stirring up the ghosts of the past, forcing her to confront the demons she had tried so hard to bury. "You were innocent, weren't you?" Loretta asked, the question a desperate plea, a yearning for the truth she had denied herself for so long. Colt met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Does it matter now, Loretta? After all this time?" "It matters to me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to know," he sighed, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. "The truth is a complicated thing, Sheriff, especially in a place like this. There are shades of gray, nuances you wouldn't understand. Try me," she challenged, stepping closer to the cell, the bars a cold, unyielding barrier between them. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The robbery, I was there, Loretta. But I didn't kill that deputy. I swear it. I was set up, framed by the very men I thought were my friends." His words resonated with a sincerity that she couldn't ignore. She wanted to believe him, desperately. But the years of doubt, the weight of the evidence, held her back. "Who, Colt? Who set you up?" He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Names that would mean nothing to you now. Men who are long gone, scattered to the winds. Men who had a grudge against your father, against the law he represented." Loretta felt a chill run down her spine. The implications of his words were staggering. Could it be true? Could her father have been the real target, Colt merely a pawn in a larger game of revenge? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Why did you run?" "I had no choice," he said, his voice laced with regret. "They would have killed me, Loretta. And they would have come after you, too. I did what I thought was best, to protect you." Protect her? The words echoed in her mind, stirring up a long-dormant hope, a flicker of the love she had thought extinguished. But could she trust him? Could she risk everything, her career, her reputation, her very life, on the word of a wanted man, a man who had betrayed her once before? The grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet room. 9 o'clock. Time was slipping away, the night growing darker, the shadows deepening. Loretta knew she had to make a decision, and she had to make it soon. She looked at Colt, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp, his eyes searching hers, pleading for understanding, for a second chance. The weight of the badge felt heavy on her chest, but beneath it, she could feel the faint, persistent beat of her heart, reminding her that she was more than just a sheriff, more than just a keeper of the law. She was a woman, with a past, with regrets, and with a love that had refused to die. The decision, she realized, was not about justice or the law. It was about trust. It was about forgiveness. It was about choosing between the shadows of the past and the possibility of a future, however uncertain. And as she looked into Colt's eyes, she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she was willing to take that risk. The first tendril of doubt about her future, and his, began to twist in her gut. Chapter 3. A Cell Between Two Hearts. The air in the sheriff's office hung heavy with unspoken words, the scent of kerosene mingling with the faint, lingering aroma of Colt's presence, leather, horses, and something indefinably wild. Loretta stood just outside his cell, the iron bars a physical manifestation of the chasm that separated them, a chasm built of years, lies, and lingering doubts. Trust, she murmured, the word echoing softly in the confined space. It's a hard thing to come by in these parts. Colt met her gaze, his stormy sky eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been hope, or perhaps just resignation. Harder still to earn back once it's lost. Loretta nodded, her fingers tracing the cold, unyielding metal of the bars. She remembered a time when trust between them had flowed as freely as the river that snaked through her father's ranch, a time before the shadows had crept in, before the accusations and the betrayal. "Tell me everything, Colt," she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. "Don't leave anything out. Tell me about the men who set you up, about what happened that night. Tell me everything, and maybe, just maybe, we can start to unravel this mess." He hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps bracing himself for the pain of reliving the past. Then, he began to speak, his voice low and steady, painting a picture of a world far more complex and dangerous than the one Loretta had known. He spoke of a network of corruption that reached far beyond the dusty streets of redemption, a web of alliances and betrayals that involved cattle barons, corrupt officials, and outlaw gangs, all vying for power and control. He named names, men Loretta had known, men she had respected, men who had been pillars of the community. Men who, according to Colt, had used her father's unwavering adherence to the law as a shield for their own illicit activities. The robbery, he explained, had been orchestrated to look like a simple heist, but its true purpose had been to eliminate a key witness who was about to expose their operation. The deputy's death had been collateral damage, a tragic consequence of a carefully laid plan. And Colt, the outsider, the rebellious ranch hand with a reputation for trouble, had been the perfect scapegoat. As he spoke, Loretta felt a growing sense of unease, a cold dread creeping into her bones. The world she had known, the world she had believed in, was crumbling around her, revealing a darker, more sinister reality beneath its surface. The foundations of her life, the principles she had held sacred, were being shaken to their core. "And my father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question a painful acknowledgement of the suspicions that had begun to take root in her mind. Was he involved? Colt shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "No, Loretta. Your father was a good man, an honest man. That's why they targeted him. He was too close to the truth, too stubborn to be bought or intimidated. They used you, Loretta, your love for him, to keep him in line, and they used me to get rid of him, indirectly." Tears welled up in Loretta's eyes, tears of grief, of anger, of a profound sense of betrayal. Her father, the man she had idolized, the man she had strived to emulate, had been a victim, a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. "Why didn't you come to me?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" "I tried," Colt said, his voice raw with regret. "The night of the robbery, I sent a message, a note with a young boy, Billy Hargrove, asking you to meet me at the old oak tree by the river. I wanted to explain, to tell you everything, but the boy never made it. They intercepted him, took the note, and well, let's just say Billy Hargrove hasn't been seen since. Loretta gasped, a wave of horror washing over her. Billy Hargrove, a sweet, innocent boy, another victim of this tangled web of deceit. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. I waited for you at the oak tree, Colt continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. But you never came. I saw the posse heading out, led by your father. I knew then that it was over, that I had to run. I had to disappear, not just for my own safety, but for yours, too. Loretta closed her eyes, the image of the old oak tree, their meeting place, a symbol of their love, now tainted with the memory of that night, of the betrayal, of the lost innocence. She had waited there, too, filled with a mixture of hope and dread, but the message had never arrived. She had assumed Colt had abandoned her, had chosen a life of crime over their love. She had been wrong. So terribly wrong. I believed them, she whispered, her voice filled with shame. I believed the lies. I let them convince me you were guilty. Colt reached through the bars, his hand gently touching hers. His touch, once so familiar, now sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the connection that still existed between them, a connection that had survived years of separation and doubt. It's not your fault, Loretta, he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a tenderness that melted the ice around her heart. They were masters of manipulation, experts at weaving a web of deceit. They played on your loyalty, your love for your father, your sense of duty. They used your own goodness against you. His words, meant to comfort, only intensified her guilt. She had been so blind, so naive, so quick to judge. She had allowed her own prejudices, her own fears, to cloud her judgment. She had condemned the man she loved without giving him a chance to defend himself. I need time, Colt, she said, pulling her hand away, the sudden break in contact sending a pang of loss through her. Time to process all of this. Time to figure out what to do. He nodded, his expression understanding. I know. I'm not going anywhere. He gestured to the cell around him with a wry smile. Loretta turned away, walking back to her desk, her mind reeling. The weight of the badge felt heavier than ever, but now it was a different kind of weight. It was the weight of responsibility, not just to uphold the law, but to right a wrong, to uncover the truth, to bring justice to those who had been denied it for so long. She sat down at her desk, her gaze falling on the wanted poster, Colt's image staring back at her. But now, she saw him differently. She saw past the outlaw, past the accusations, to the man she had once loved, the man who had been wronged, the man who deserved a second chance. She picked up the poster, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, the familiar curve of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she tore the poster in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the floor like confetti. A new resolve hardened within her. She would find the truth, no matter the cost. She would clear Colt's name, expose the men who had orchestrated this conspiracy, and bring them to justice. It was a daunting task, a dangerous path, but she was no longer afraid. She had a purpose, a mission, and a renewed sense of hope, fueled by the embers of a love that had refused to die. She looked toward the cell. Colt was watching her, a faint question in his eyes. She gave a curt nod, and that tendril of doubt twisted again, tighter, more painful than before. What if she was wrong? Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty. The silence that followed Loretta's silent declaration was thick and heavy, filled with unspoken questions and a fragile, tentative trust. She could feel Colt's gaze on her, a silent inquiry that she couldn't quite meet. The implications of her actions tearing up the wanted poster, implicitly siding with a known outlaw, were staggering. She was risking everything: her career, her reputation, the legacy of her family. Loretta got up and paced. She began to methodically check the locks on the front door and windows of the office, her movements precise and deliberate, a way to ground herself in the familiar routine amidst the swirling chaos of her thoughts. The town outside was quieter now, the raucous sounds from the rusty spur having died down to a low murmur. The moon, a silver sliver in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows across the wooden floor. As she finished securing the office, she turned back towards the cell block, steeling herself to face Colt. He was leaning against the bars, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "What now, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that broke the silence. Loretta took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "Now we talk. We plan. We figure out how to expose these men, without getting ourselves killed in the process." She walked over to a small, rickety table in the corner of the office, pulling out 2 chairs. "Sit," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Colt hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the cell door, a door she hadn't locked, and walked towards the table. The absence of the physical barrier between them, the simple act of him choosing to stay, sent a small wave of relief through her. They sat facing each other, the table a small island of intimacy in the vast, lonely space of the office. Loretta poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that always simmered on the small stove in the corner, the strong, bitter aroma filling the air. The coffee was lukewarm and tasted like burnt dirt, but it was a familiar comfort, a small ritual that helped to ground her. "You said these men had a grudge against my father," Loretta began, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on Colt's face. "What kind of grudge?" Colt took a sip of his coffee, his expression grim. "It goes back years, Loretta, long before you were even born. Your grandfather, the first Sheriff Boone, was a hard man, a stickler for the law. He made a lot of enemies, powerful enemies, men who controlled the cattle trade, the water rights, the very lifeblood of this territory." He went on to explain a complex history of land disputes, water wars, and political maneuvering, a tangled web of rivalries and resentments that had festered for generations. Her grandfather, it seemed, had stood in the way of their ambitions, had refused to be bought or intimidated, had upheld the law even when it meant making powerful enemies. "These men, they bided their time," Colt continued. "They waited for their opportunity. Your father inherited your grandfather's enemies, along with his badge. They saw him as a continuation of the same threat, a roadblock to their plans." Loretta listened intently, her mind racing, piecing together the fragments of information, connecting the dots, forming a picture that was both shocking and disturbing. The men Colt had named were not just strangers, they were names she had grown up with, men who had been friends of her father, men who had sat at their dinner table, men who had held positions of power and influence in the community. "Judge Thompson," she said, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. "He was one of them?" Colt nodded. "He was the linchpin, Loretta. The one who controlled the courts, the one who could make evidence disappear, witnesses vanish. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes." Judge Thompson, a man she had respected, a man she had considered a mentor, a man who had presided over countless trials, dispensing justice with a seemingly unwavering hand. The thought that he had been corrupt, that he had been involved in this conspiracy, was almost too much to bear. "And Silas Miller," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The owner of the Double Diamond Ranch. He was involved, too? Silas Miller, her father's closest friend, the man who had been like an uncle to her, the man who had offered her comfort and support after her father's death." The betrayal cut deep, a wound that reopened old scars, reminding her of the pain and loss she had endured. Colt saw the pain in her eyes, the struggle she was facing. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent offer of support. "I know it's hard, Loretta," he said softly, "but you need to understand the stakes. These men are powerful, ruthless. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them, including you." His words sent a chill down her spine, a stark reminder of the danger they were facing. She was no longer just a sheriff upholding the law, she was a target, a threat to their carefully constructed world. What about the others? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The ones who were directly involved in the robbery, the ones who framed you? Dead, Colt said bluntly. All of them. Killed in various accidents over the years. Conveniently silenced, their secrets buried with them. Loretta felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for justice. These men had not only destroyed Colt's life, they had taken innocent lives, had corrupted the very fabric of their community. They had to be stopped. We need proof, she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. Something concrete, something that can't be explained away, something that will stand up in court. Colt nodded. There might be something. A ledger. Your grandfather kept detailed records of everything, transactions, payments, names. He hid it somewhere, a safeguard against the very men who were trying to destroy him. A ledger. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. A chance to finally uncover the truth, to bring these men to justice. Where is it? Loretta asked, her heart pounding with anticipation. Colt hesitated, his eyes searching hers. I don't know for sure, but I have a hunch. A place your grandfather used to go, a place he considered sacred. A place where he felt safe. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. The old Indian burial ground, up on Shadow Mesa. Loretta felt a shiver run down her spine. Shadow Mesa. A place of legends, of whispers, of ancient secrets. A place she had been warned to avoid as a child. A place shrouded in mystery and fear. It's a long shot, Colt said, his voice low. But it's the only lead we have. Loretta knew he was right. It was a dangerous gamble, a journey into the unknown, but it was a risk they had to take. She looked at Colt, his face etched with determination, his eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. The doubt was still there, a knot tightening in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose, a shared mission, a bond forged in the crucible of adversity. She also couldn't deny the flicker of something else she saw in his eyes. Something she had tried for years to stomp out in her own heart. Hope. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Wind. The decision to ride to Shadow Mesa hung between them, unspoken yet understood. The journey would be perilous, not only because of the treacherous terrain but also because of the men they were pursuing. Judge Thompson and Silas Miller wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their power, and Loretta knew that included her. We leave at first light, Loretta said, her voice firm, breaking the silence. We'll need supplies, horses, and weapons. Colt nodded, his gaze meeting hers. I'll take care of the horses. Diablo is still in your stable, and I saw a couple of decent mounts in there as well. Loretta raised an eyebrow. You noticed a lot for a man who just rode into town and surrendered. He gave a wry smile. Old habits die hard, Sheriff. I've spent 15 years looking over my shoulder, noticing every detail, every potential threat. It's become second nature. She understood. The years of running, of hiding, of constantly being on guard had left their mark on him. He was a different man than the carefree ranch hand she had known, harder, more cautious, more dangerous. And yet, beneath that hardened exterior, she could still see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had laughed easily, who had held her close under the starry sky, who had whispered promises of forever. Loretta went to the gun cabinet, a heavy, oak piece of furniture that had belonged to her father. She unlocked it, the metal key cold against her fingers, and pulled out 2 rifles, a Winchester repeater for herself and a heavier Sharps rifle for Colt. She also grabbed 2 Colt peacemakers, checking the cylinders to make sure they were loaded. You still know how to use one of these? She asked, handing Colt one of the revolvers. He took the gun, his fingers wrapping around the familiar grip, his eyes taking on a distant look. It's like riding a horse, Sheriff. You never really forget. He spun the cylinder, the clicking sound sharp in the quiet room, then holstered the weapon with a practiced ease. The movement was fluid, graceful, a testament to years of experience. It was also a reminder of the dangerous world they were about to enter, a world where survival often depended on speed and accuracy. They spent the next hour gathering supplies, food, water, blankets, ammunition, packing everything into saddlebags. Loretta felt a strange sense of calm, a focus that came from having a clear objective, a mission to accomplish. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a determination to see this through, to uncover the truth, to bring justice to those who had been wronged. As they worked, they talked, sharing stories, memories, filling in the gaps of the 15 years they had been apart. Colt spoke of his life on the run, the various jobs he had taken, the places he had seen, the constant threat of discovery hanging over him. Loretta told him about her life in redemption, the challenges of being a female sheriff, the loneliness, the burden of upholding her father's legacy. They talked about her father, too, sharing memories of the man they had both loved and respected. Loretta spoke of his unwavering sense of justice, his dedication to the law, his kindness, his quiet strength. Colt spoke of his respect for her father, his regret at having disappointed him, his determination to clear his name and honor the memory of the man who had given him a chance. As the night wore on, a fragile bond began to form between them, a connection built on shared loss, shared memories, and a shared purpose. The years of separation, the bitterness, the resentment, began to fade, replaced by a tentative understanding, a cautious hope. Finally, as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink, they were ready. They led the horses out of the stable, the cool morning air crisp against their faces. The town was still asleep, the only sound the gentle creaking of the saddle leather and the soft thud of the horses' hooves on the dusty ground. Loretta mounted her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, and looked at Colt, who was astride Diablo, his magnificent black stallion. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the faint light of dawn. "Ready, Sheriff?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Loretta took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. "Ready as I'll ever be." They rode out of town, side by side, their silhouettes outlined against the rising sun. The journey to Shadow Mesa would be long and arduous, a test of their endurance, their courage, and their newfound trust. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry the secrets of the past, the hopes of the future, and the dangers that lay ahead. Loretta, with her hand resting on the butt of her Winchester, felt them all. As they left redemption behind, she wondered if either of them would ever return. Chapter 6. The Unspoken Truth. The ride to Shadow Mesa was a journey through a landscape that mirrored the turmoil in Loretta's heart. The familiar rolling hills and open plains gave way to rugged canyons, towering mesas, and treacherous, winding trails. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth, turning the air shimmering and hazy. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. They rode in silence for the most part, each lost in their own thoughts. Loretta found herself stealing glances at Colt, studying his profile, the way he sat his horse, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, ever vigilant. He moved with a grace and confidence that spoke of years spent in the saddle, a natural ease that was both captivating and unsettling. She couldn't deny the attraction she still felt for him, a pull that was both physical and emotional. It was a dangerous feeling, a distraction she couldn't afford, but she couldn't seem to shake it. 15 years had passed, but the memory of his touch, his kiss, the way he made her feel, was still vivid in her mind. But beneath that attraction, a current of unease ran deep. She still didn't fully trust him. The years of betrayal, the lies, the unanswered questions had left their mark. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the possibility of redemption, but a part of her remained guarded, cautious, afraid of being hurt again. As they rode, Colt began to point out landmarks, sharing stories of his youth, of his time working on her father's ranch. He spoke of hidden springs, secret canyons, ancient Indian trails, revealing a knowledge of the land that was both intimate and profound. "Your father taught me a lot," he said, his voice softening. He knew this land better than anyone. He respected it, understood its power, its beauty, its dangers. Loretta nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and sadness. Her father had loved this land, had dedicated his life to protecting it, to upholding the law. And in the end, it had cost him everything. "He would have been proud of you, Loretta," Colt said, his eyes meeting hers. "The way you've carried on his legacy, the way you've stood up for what's right, even when it's been hard." His words warmed her, a balm to her wounded soul. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the burden she had carried, the sacrifices she had made. It was a validation she hadn't realized she craved. As the day wore on, the terrain became increasingly difficult, the trail narrowing, winding its way up the steep slopes of Shadow Mesa. The horses struggled, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their hooves slipping on the loose rocks. Loretta could feel the tension in Colt's body, his alertness heightened, his senses on full alert. "We're getting close," he said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs. "Keep your eyes open. This place is known for its surprises." Loretta knew what he meant. Shadow Mesa was not only a sacred burial ground for the local Indian tribes, it was also a haven for outlaws, a place of refuge for those seeking to escape the law. It was a place of shadows, of secrets, of hidden dangers. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Colt suddenly pulled up his horse, his body stiffening, his hand going to his rifle. Loretta followed his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. In the distance, nestled amongst the towering cliffs, she saw it. A small, stone structure, partially hidden by a cluster of ancient juniper trees. It was the old Indian burial ground, the place where her grandfather had supposedly hidden the ledger. But it wasn't the structure that had caught Colt's attention. It was the movement. A flicker of something, a shadow shifting amongst the rocks. Someone was there. Colt dismounted, his movements quick and silent, handing Loretta the reins to Diablo. He motioned for her to stay put. Then, rifle in hand, he began to move forward, stealthily, using the rocks and trees for cover. Loretta watched him go, her heart in her throat. She felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for Colt. She didn't want to lose him again. Not now, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. She dismounted as well, tying the horses to a nearby tree, then drew her own rifle, her senses on high alert. She scanned the surrounding landscape, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The silence was deafening, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of a bird. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the unspoken truth that hung heavy between them. They were not alone. Loretta moved slowly, cautiously, following the path Colt had taken, her rifle ready. She could feel the presence of others, unseen, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, a primal instinct warning her of danger. She had to be careful, had to be prepared. The truth, she knew, was often guarded by more than just shadows. It was guarded by men who would kill to keep it hidden. A sudden crack of a twig behind her spun her instantly. Winchester Chapter 7. Scars of Yesterday. Loretta whirled around, rifle raised, her finger tightening on the trigger. The sudden noise had shattered the tense silence, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. Her eyes scanned the rocks and scrub behind her, searching for the source of the sound. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the juniper trees, the rustling of dry leaves, the distant caw of a crow. But the feeling of being watched, the prickling on her skin, remained. She lowered her rifle slightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart still pounding against her ribs. "Colt?" She called out softly, her voice barely a whisper, hoping he was close enough to hear. No answer. A wave of fear washed over her. Had something happened to him? Had he been ambushed? She fought to control her panic, to keep her senses sharp. She couldn't afford to lose her focus, not now. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down, to think rationally. She had to trust Colt. He knew this land, knew the dangers. He wouldn't have gone in blindly. He had a plan. Slowly, cautiously, she began to move forward, following the faint trail Colt had left in the dust. She kept her rifle ready, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape, her ears straining for any sound that might betray the presence of others. As she rounded a large boulder, she saw him. He was crouched behind a cluster of rocks, his rifle trained on the stone structure in the distance. He turned his head slightly, sensing her presence, and put a finger to his lips, signaling her to be silent. Loretta crept up beside him, her body pressed against the cool rock, her heart still pounding, but now with a sense of relief. He was alive. He was safe.
"What is it?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible. Colt pointed towards the structure. 2 men.
"Armed."
"They're guarding the entrance." Loretta peered through a gap in the rocks, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She could see them now, 2 figures silhouetted against the stone wall, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. They were rough-looking men, dressed in dusty, worn clothing, their faces hardened by years of living on the edge of the law. "Miller's men," Colt whispered, his voice grim. "I recognize one of them. Jake, the Snake Slattery. He's a cold-blooded killer. Works for Silas whenever there is dirty business at hand." Loretta felt a chill run down her spine. Silas Miller. Her father's friend. The man who had betrayed them all. The thought that he had sent these men here, to guard the ledger, to protect his secrets, fueled her anger, her determination. "What's the plan?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the 2 men. Colt outlined his plan, his voice low and steady. He would circle around, create a distraction, draw their attention away from the entrance. Loretta would then make her move, get inside the structure, find the ledger. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only option. They couldn't afford to wait, to hesitate. They had to act quickly, decisively. "Be careful, Colt," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and concern. He met her gaze, his eyes holding a warmth, a tenderness, that sent a shiver through her. "You too, Sheriff. And Loretta, don't hesitate. Not with these 2. He slipped away, disappearing into the rocks and shadows, leaving Loretta alone, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, counting the seconds, her senses on high alert. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, shattering the silence, followed by another and another. The sound echoed through the canyons, bouncing off the cliffs, sending a flock of birds scattering into the sky. Loretta knew it was Colt, creating his distraction. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, then made her move. She sprinted towards the structure, her rifle held tight, her eyes fixed on the entrance. As she reached the doorway, she saw one of the guards, Slattery, running towards the sound of the gunfire, his back to her. She raised her rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot hit him square in the back, sending him sprawling to the ground. He let out a cry of pain, then lay still. Loretta didn't hesitate. She stepped over his body, her stomach churning, her heart pounding, and entered the structure. The interior was dark and cool, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. It was a small, circular room, with walls made of rough-hewn stone. In the center of the room, a stone altar stood, covered in faded carvings and ancient symbols. Loretta's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the ledger. She saw nothing, just the bare stone walls, the altar, and a few scattered bones, remnants of past burials. She felt a surge of disappointment, a wave of despair. Had they come all this way for nothing? Was the ledger even here?
Then she noticed something.
A small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall, behind the altar. She moved closer, her heart pounding with anticipation. She ran her fingers along the crack, feeling for a hidden latch, a secret opening. Her fingers brushed against something, a small, metal lever. She pulled the lever, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, hidden chamber. And there, inside the chamber, she saw it. A wooden box, bound in leather, its edges worn and faded. The ledger. Loretta reached for the box, her hands trembling with excitement. She had found it. She had the proof. She had the key to unlocking the truth, to exposing the men who had destroyed her life and Colt's. But as she lifted the box, she heard a sound behind her. A soft, guttural growl. She turned, slowly, her heart sinking. Standing in the doorway, his face twisted in a sneer, was the second guard. The one Colt was supposed to have distracted. And he had a gun pointed straight at her. His eyes were narrowed, his face a mask of cruelty, with a long, jagged scar running down his cheek, a testament to a life of violence, a scar of yesterday. The guard raised his gun a little higher, his finger moving to the trigger, and sneered, well. Looks like the sheriff found herself a little treasure. Chapter 8. Renegade's Return. Loretta froze, the wooden box containing the ledger heavy in her hands. The guard, a burly man with a cruel sneer and that distinctive scar, advanced slowly, his gun unwavering. His eyes, cold and predatory, were fixed on her, taking in her every detail, every flicker of fear. "Drop the box, Sheriff," he growled, his voice rough and menacing. "And the gun." "Nice and slow." Loretta hesitated. Her mind raced, calculating her options. She could try to shoot him, but he was too close, his gun already aimed. She could try to run, but the doorway was narrow, and he would have a clear shot. She was trapped. Slowly, carefully, she lowered the box to the ground, the wood scraping against the stone floor. Then, she unholstered her peacemaker, letting it fall beside the box. She raised her hands, palms open, showing him she was unarmed. "Smart move, Sheriff," the guard said, his sneer widening. "Now kick the box and the gun over here. And don't try anything foolish. I'd just as soon shoot you as look at you." Loretta complied, pushing the box and the gun towards him with her foot. The guard kept his weapon trained on her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Where's your boyfriend?" he asked, his voice laced with contempt. "The renegade. Did he send you in here to do his dirty work?" Loretta didn't answer. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing anything about Colt, about their plan. The guard chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Doesn't matter. He's a dead man walking anyway. Silas will be pleased to have both your hides." He gestured with his gun. "Turn around. Face the wall." Loretta hesitated again. Turning her back to him was the most vulnerable position she could be in. But she had no choice. She slowly turned, her heart pounding against her ribs, her senses on high alert. She heard him take a step closer, the sound of his boots scraping against the stone floor. She braced herself, expecting the shot, the searing pain, the darkness. But it didn't come. Instead, she heard a different sound. A whoosh of air, a thud, a grunt of pain. She whirled around, her eyes widening in disbelief. Colt stood over the fallen guard, his rifle held like a club, his face a mask of fury. The guard lay on the ground, unconscious, his gun lying a few feet away. Loretta let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her body trembling with relief. He had come back. He had saved her. "Colt," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something deeper, something that made her heart skip a beat. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Loretta nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. I thought she couldn't finish the sentence, the words caught in her throat. The fear, the relief, the overwhelming sense of gratitude washed over her. Colt holstered his rifle and reached for her, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch, warm and reassuring, sent a jolt of electricity through her. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here. You're safe." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Loretta buried her face in his chest, her body trembling against his. She felt his heart beating strong and steady against hers, a rhythm of life, of hope, of survival. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in an embrace, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing, the whisper of the wind through the doorway. It was a moment of profound connection, a moment of shared vulnerability, a moment that transcended the danger, the fear, the uncertainty. Finally, Loretta pulled away, her eyes searching his.
"How?"
"I saw him heading back this way," Colt explained. "I doubled back, followed him. I knew he wouldn't let you walk out of here alive." He looked down at the unconscious guard, his expression grim. Looks like I was right. Loretta nodded, her gaze falling on the wooden box, the ledger, lying on the floor. The object of their perilous journey, the key to unlocking the truth, now seemed almost insignificant compared to the bond that had been forged between them, the connection that had been rekindled in the face of danger. Colt followed her gaze. "We should go," he said, his voice low, "before more of Miller's men show up." Loretta nodded again. She picked up the box, her fingers wrapping around the worn leather, feeling the weight of its contents, the weight of the secrets it held. She also retrieved her peacemaker, holstering it securely. They left the structure, stepping out into the bright sunlight, the vast expanse of the landscape stretching out before them. They retrieved their horses, mounted, and rode away from Shadow Mesa, leaving the unconscious guard behind, a silent testament to their close call, to their shared victory. As they rode, Loretta couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense of unease that had settled over her. They had the ledger, but they were far from safe. Silas Miller and Judge Thompson wouldn't give up easily. They would come after them, with everything they had. She looked at Colt, his profile etched against the bright sky, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was a renegade, a wanted man, a man with a past. But he was also a man who had risked his life to save hers, a man who had shown her courage, loyalty, and a tenderness she had thought long gone. And as they rode, side by side, towards an uncertain future, she knew that the lines between law and outlaw, between right and wrong, had blurred, and that her journey with this renegade was far from over. Something passed unsaid between them. She knew, without asking, he was thinking the very same thing. Chapter 9. The Dance of Deception. The ride back to redemption was tense and silent. The exhilaration of finding the ledger and escaping Shadow Mesa had faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. They knew Silas Miller and Judge Thompson wouldn't let them get away with this. They were now marked, targets in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Loretta glanced at Colt, riding beside her. His face was set, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. She wondered what he was thinking, what plans were forming in his mind. She knew he wouldn't stay in redemption for long. He was a wanted man, and the town was no longer safe for him. Or for her. As they approached the outskirts of town, Loretta pulled up her horse. "We can't just ride in there," she said, her voice low. "They'll be expecting us. We need a plan." Colt nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "We need to get the ledger to someone we can trust, someone who can expose Miller and Thompson, someone who has the power to bring them to justice." "Who?" Loretta asked, her mind racing. "Everyone in town is either under their thumb or too afraid to stand up to them." Colt thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "There's one person. Sheriff Marcus Bell, in Silver Creek. He's a good man, honest. He and your father were friends, served together in the Territorial Rangers years ago. He's the only one I can think of who might be able to help." Silver Creek was a 2-day ride, a long and dangerous journey through territory controlled by Miller's men. But it was their only hope. "We can't go to my office," Loretta said. "It's the first place they'll look. We need to hide the ledger, somewhere safe, until we can make arrangements to get it to Bell."
Colt nodded again.
"I know a place. An old abandoned mine just outside of town. It's hidden off the main trail. No one goes there anymore." They rode to the mine, a dark, gaping hole in the side of a hill, hidden by a cluster of scrub oak and mesquite. The entrance was partially collapsed, the timbers rotting and crumbling. It was a desolate, forgotten place, a perfect hiding spot. They dismounted, Colt leading the way into the mine, his rifle held ready. The air inside was cool and damp, the smell of earth and decay heavy in the air. They followed the narrow tunnel, the darkness growing deeper with each step. Finally, Colt stopped at a small alcove, a niche in the rock wall. He placed the ledger inside, covering it with loose rocks and dirt. "It should be safe here," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space.
"For now."
They emerged from the mine, blinking in the bright sunlight. Loretta felt a sense of relief, knowing the ledger was hidden, safe from prying eyes. But the danger was far from over. We need to split up, Colt said, his voice low. It's too risky for us to be seen together. I'll head out, draw their attention away from you. You stay here, lay low, and try to contact Bell. Send him a telegram, discreetly. Tell him what's happened, tell him about the ledger. Loretta didn't like the plan. She didn't want to be separated from Colt, not now, not after everything they had been through. But she knew he was right. It was the only way. Be careful, Colt, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He met her gaze, his eyes holding a warmth, a tenderness, that sent a shiver through her. I will. You too, Sheriff. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it spoke volumes. It was a promise, a farewell, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between them. Then, he mounted Diablo and rode away, disappearing into the vast expanse of the landscape. Loretta watched him go, her heart aching, a sense of loneliness washing over her. She was alone again, facing an uncertain future, a dangerous enemy. She made her way back to town, cautiously, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the shadows. She reached her small, modest house on the edge of town, a haven of peace and solitude. She went inside, locking the door behind her, the familiar surroundings a comfort in the midst of the chaos. She sat down at her kitchen table, her mind racing, trying to figure out how to contact Sheriff Bell without alerting Miller and Thompson. She couldn't go to the telegraph office. It was too public, too risky. She needed a more discreet way. Then she remembered. Old Mrs. Henderson, the town's resident gossip, had a telegraph machine in her parlor. She used it to communicate with her far-flung family. She had shown it off to Loretta once, proud of her modern contraption. It was a long shot, but it was her only option. Mrs. Henderson was a nosy old woman, but she was also kind-hearted, and she had always been fond of Loretta. Loretta waited until nightfall. Then, under the cover of darkness, she made her way to Mrs. Henderson's house, a small, quaint cottage on a quiet side street. She knocked softly on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Henderson, a plump, elderly woman with a cloud of white hair and a perpetually curious expression, opened the door, peering out at Loretta with surprise. Sheriff Boone? What on earth are you doing here at this hour? Is something wrong? Loretta stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Mrs. Henderson, I need your help. It's a matter of life and death. She looked around to make sure no one was listening, and, lowering her voice, she added, and you cannot breathe a word of this to anyone. She explained the situation, telling Mrs. Henderson about Colt, about the ledger, about Miller and Thompson's corruption. She kept her voice low, urgent, her eyes pleading with the old woman to understand the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Henderson listened intently, her eyes widening with each revelation, her mouth forming a silent O of astonishment. When Loretta finished, the old woman was visibly shaken, but her eyes held a spark of determination. Of course, Sheriff, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'll help you. You can use my telegraph. But we must be careful. Very careful. They went into Mrs. Henderson's parlor, a cluttered room filled with Victorian furniture, knickknacks, and family photographs. The telegraph machine sat on a small table by the window, a marvel of modern technology amidst the old-fashioned surroundings. Loretta carefully crafted the telegram to Sheriff Bell, explaining the situation, giving him the location of the ledger, urging him to come to redemption as quickly as possible. She used coded language, referring to Miller and Thompson as the wolves and the ledger as the shepherd's crook. Mrs. Henderson tapped out the message on the telegraph, her fingers moving with surprising speed and dexterity. The clicking sound of the machine filled the room, a rhythmic pulse of hope in the midst of the darkness. When the message was sent, Loretta felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done all she could. Now it was up to Sheriff Bell. She thanked Mrs. Henderson, her voice filled with gratitude. You're a true friend, Mrs. Henderson. You may have just saved our lives. The old woman smiled, her eyes twinkling. Nonsense, Sheriff. It's my civic duty. And besides, she added with a wink, It's been a long time since anything this exciting happened in Redemption. Loretta smiled back, a genuine smile, the first one in days. She left Mrs. Henderson's house, feeling a renewed sense of hope, a flicker of optimism in the midst of the darkness. She had taken the first step towards exposing Miller and Thompson, towards clearing Colt's name, towards reclaiming her town. But she knew the dance of deception was far from over. The wolves were still out there, circling, waiting, and she had to be ready for them. She wondered what Colt was doing, whether he had evaded Miller's men, and most troublingly, if he was still alive. Chapter 10. A glimmer of hope. The next 2 days were a torment of waiting. Loretta stayed holed up in her house, venturing out only when necessary, always careful to avoid being seen. She jumped at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, her nerves stretched taut. She knew Miller and Thompson wouldn't be idle. They would be searching for her, for Colt, for the ledger. She spent her time cleaning her weapons, going over the details of the ledger's contents in her mind, trying to anticipate Miller and Thompson's next move. She also thought about Colt, constantly. She wondered where he was, if he was safe, if he was thinking of her. The memory of his touch, his embrace, his words of comfort, kept her going, a flickering flame of hope in the darkness. She had received no reply from Sheriff Bell. The silence was deafening, amplifying her anxiety. Had he received her message? Was he on his way? Or had something gone wrong? On the third day, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a knock on her door startled her. She froze, her hand instinctively going to her peacemaker. She peered through the window, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Mrs. Henderson, her face pale and anxious. Loretta opened the door cautiously, pulling the old woman inside. "What is it?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Sheriff," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice trembling. "I just received a reply from Sheriff Bell. He's on his way. He said he'd be here by tomorrow morning." Relief washed over Loretta, so intense it almost buckled her knees. Bell was coming.
Help was on the way. They had a chance.
But Mrs. Henderson's next words wiped the relief away. "But that's not all," the old woman continued, her eyes wide with fear. "I think someone intercepted the message." There was a strange clicking sound on the line, a delay. And I saw Silas Miller's foreman, that man with the scar, lurking around my house earlier today. Loretta's blood ran cold. Miller knew. He knew about the telegram, about Sheriff Bell. He would be waiting for them. "We have to warn Bell," Loretta said, her mind racing. "He'll be riding right into a trap." But how? It was too late to send another telegram. Miller would be watching the lines. They had to intercept Bell, warn him before he reached Redemption. "I'll go," Loretta said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. "I'll ride out, meet him on the trail." It was a dangerous plan, a desperate gamble. But she had no choice. She couldn't let Bell walk into Miller's trap. She had to warn him. She quickly gathered her supplies, her rifle, her ammunition, a canteen of water. She strapped on her peacemaker, the familiar weight of comfort in her hand. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, turning to the old woman. "Thank you for everything. You've been a true friend." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Be careful, Sheriff. Godspeed." Loretta stepped out into the night, the cool air crisp against her face. She mounted Belle, her sturdy bay mare, and rode out of town, heading towards the main trail that led to Silver Creek. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the landscape. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of Belle's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Loretta rode hard, pushing Belle to her limits. She had to reach Bell before it was too late. She had to warn him. As she rode, she thought about Colt. She wondered if he was safe, if he knew about Miller's plan. She wished he were here, riding beside her, sharing the burden, the danger. She thought about the ledger, too, the secrets it held, the power it possessed. It was more than just a book, it was a symbol of hope, a weapon against corruption, a testament to her grandfather's courage. She thought about her father, too, the man who had taught her everything she knew, the man who had instilled in her a sense of justice, a commitment to the law. She was doing this for him, for his memory, for the legacy he had left behind. But most of all, she was doing this for herself, for the woman she had become, the woman who had found her strength, her courage, her purpose, in the midst of adversity. She was no longer just a sheriff, upholding the law. She was a warrior, fighting for justice, for freedom, for the future of her town. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Loretta saw him. A lone rider, silhouetted against the rising sun. Sheriff Bell. She urged Bell forward, her heart pounding with relief. She had made it. She had reached him in time. But as she drew closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Behind Bell, riding hard, were several other figures.
Miller's men.
They were closing in, their rifles raised. Loretta knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was riding into a trap. But she also knew she had no choice. She had to warn Bell, even if it meant sacrificing herself. She spurred Bell forward, her rifle ready, her eyes fixed on the riders ahead. The glimmer of hope that had sustained her through the long night was now overshadowed by a grim determination. She would fight. She would protect Bell. She would not surrender. Even if she knew deep in her heart that her actions would likely lead to a final confrontation with the men who controlled redemption. And likely with Colt as well. Chapter 11. The Gathering Storm. Loretta spurred Bell into a full gallop, the wind whipping past her face, her rifle held tight in her grip. She had to reach Sheriff Bell before Miller's men did. She had to warn him.
Bell.
She shouted, her voice hoarse, carried away by the wind. It's a trap. Turn back. Bell, a tall, imposing figure with a weathered face and steely gray eyes, turned in his saddle, his expression registering surprise, then alarm, as he saw Loretta approaching, followed closely by Miller's men. He didn't hesitate. He understood the situation instantly. He wheeled his horse around, drawing his own rifle, his movements quick and decisive.
Get behind me, Sheriff.
He shouted to Loretta. We'll make a stand. Loretta joined him, positioning Bell alongside his horse. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were not defeated. They were lawmen, sworn to uphold justice, to protect the innocent, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Miller's men, led by the scarred foreman, Jake the Snake Slattery, fanned out, forming a semicircle, their rifles aimed. They were a motley crew, rough-looking men, their faces hardened by years of violence and lawlessness. Hold your fire, Slattery shouted, his voice raspy and menacing. We just want the woman and the ledger. Hand them over, Bell, and we'll let you live. Bell didn't answer. He met Slattery's gaze, his eyes cold and unwavering. He knew they couldn't trust him. They wouldn't let them live. Loretta, Bell said, his voice low, his eyes still fixed on Slattery. When I give the word, ride. Ride like hell. Get to Silver Creek. Get help. Loretta shook her head.
I'm not leaving you, Bell.
We fight together. Bell smiled, a grim, determined smile. Stubborn woman. Just like your father. He raised his voice, addressing Slattery and his men. You want us? Come and get us. The silence that followed was broken by the roar of gunfire. Miller's men opened fire, their bullets whizzing past Loretta and Bell, kicking up dust and dirt. Loretta and Bell returned fire, their rifles cracking, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. It was a chaotic scene, a whirlwind of bullets, shouts, and the thud of horses' hooves. Loretta aimed and fired, her shots precise and deadly. She saw one of Miller's men fall from his horse, clutching his chest. She saw another go down, his leg shattered by a bullet. But there were too many of them. They were closing in, their fire relentless. Loretta felt a sharp pain in her arm, a searing heat that made her gasp. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her sleeve. She had been hit. Bell saw her injury, his eyes filled with concern. Loretta, are you all right? I'm fine, she said, gritting her teeth against the pain. Keep firing. They continued to fight, back to back, their rifles blazing. But they were losing ground, being pushed back, overwhelmed by the sheer number of their attackers. Suddenly, a new sound joined the cacophony of gunfire. A distant rumble, growing louder, closer. Loretta looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. Riding towards them, at full gallop, was a group of riders, their faces grim, their rifles ready. And leading them, astride his magnificent black stallion, Diablo, was Colt. He had come back. He had heard the gunfire, seen the danger, and he had come to their rescue. The arrival of Colt and his men changed the tide of the battle. Miller's men, surprised and outflanked, began to falter. Their fire became less accurate, their movements less coordinated. Colt rode straight into the fray, his rifle blazing, his voice booming across the battlefield. For Loretta. For redemption. His men followed him, their shouts echoing his, their guns blazing. They were a force of nature, a whirlwind of fury, sweeping through Miller's men like a storm. Loretta felt a surge of hope, a renewed sense of determination. They were not alone. They had a chance. She continued to fight, her injured arm throbbing, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. She saw Slattery, his face twisted in rage, his eyes fixed on Colt. He raised his rifle, aiming at Colt's back. Loretta didn't hesitate. She raised her own rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot hit Slattery square in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse. He lay on the ground, his body still, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The remaining members of Miller's gang, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They turned their horses and fled, disappearing into the vast expanse of the landscape. The battle was over. They had won. Loretta lowered her rifle, her body trembling with exhaustion, her arm throbbing with pain. She looked at Colt, who was riding towards her, his face etched with concern. "Loretta," he shouted, his voice filled with relief. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears.
I'm fine. Thanks to you.
He dismounted, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Loretta buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with the aftermath of the adrenaline, the fear, the relief. Bell joined them, his face grim, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Colt, you saved our lives. I owe you one." Colt shook his head. "We're even, Bell. We're all in this together." They stood there for a moment, the three of them, united by the battle, by the shared danger, by the common goal. The storm had gathered, raged, and passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction, but also a glimmer of hope. The fight was far from over, but they had won a crucial victory. They had survived. And they were ready to face whatever came next. Loretta looked up at Colt, a question in her eyes. He gave a slight nod. It was not over, not by a long shot, but for now they could breathe. Chapter 12. Crossroads of the Heart. The aftermath of the battle was a blur of activity. Loretta's arm was bandaged, the bleeding stanched, but the pain was a constant, throbbing reminder of her close call. They gathered the horses, checked for other injuries, and made a grim count of the fallen. Several of Miller's men were dead, including Slattery. The rest had fled, scattering into the wilderness. Sheriff Bell, his face etched with weariness and gratitude, shook Colt's hand. "I don't know how to thank you, Dawson. You saved our lives. You and your men." Colt nodded, his expression somber. "We're in this together, Bell. Miller and Thompson are a threat to all of us. They need to be stopped." The men Colt had ridden in with were a ragtag group of ranchers and homesteaders, men who had suffered under Miller and Thompson's corrupt rule. They were not outlaws, but ordinary citizens who had been pushed too far, who had finally decided to fight back. "We need to get to Silver Creek," Bell said, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Regroup, get reinforcements, and then come back to Redemption and take down Miller and Thompson for good." Loretta agreed. "We have the ledger, Bell. The proof we need to expose them. But we need to protect it, and ourselves." They decided to split up again. Bell, along with the ranchers and homesteaders, would ride to Silver Creek, gather reinforcements, and prepare for their return to Redemption. Loretta and Colt would return to the abandoned mine, retrieve the ledger, and then head to a safe house Loretta knew, a secluded cabin in the foothills, where they could lay low and wait for Belle's return. It was a risky plan, but it was their best option. They couldn't stay in Redemption. It was too dangerous. And they couldn't risk losing the ledger. As Belle and his men rode away, Loretta and Colt turned their horses towards the abandoned mine. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was cool and crisp, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Loretta's mind was racing, replaying the events of the day, the battle, her injury, Colt's arrival. She was grateful to be alive, grateful for Colt's help, but she was also filled with a sense of unease, a premonition of danger. She glanced at Colt, riding beside her. His face was set, his eyes focused on the trail ahead. She wondered what he was thinking, what emotions were swirling beneath that stoic exterior. "Colt," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "Thank you for saving us, for coming back." He met her gaze, his eyes softening. "I told you, Loretta. I wouldn't leave you. Not ever again." His words sent a shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the years of doubt, the scars of the past, still lingered. They reached the mine, dismounted, and entered the dark, damp tunnel. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and decay. They retrieved the ledger, the wooden box feeling heavy and significant in Loretta's hands. As they emerged from the mine, the last rays of the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Loretta felt a sudden chill, a prickling on her skin. She looked around, her senses on high alert. "What is it?" Colt asked, sensing her unease. "I don't know," she said, her voice low. I have a bad feeling." They mounted their horses and rode towards the foothills, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged and mountainous. The cabin was nestled in a secluded valley, hidden by a dense growth of pine trees. It was a small, rustic structure, built of logs and stone, a haven of peace and solitude. As they approached the cabin, Loretta saw something that made her heart stop. Smoke. A thin column of smoke was rising from the chimney, curling into the evening sky. Someone was there. Colt saw it too. He pulled up his horse, his hand going to his rifle. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'll check it out." Loretta shook her head. "No. We go together." They dismounted, tying their horses to a nearby tree, and approached the cabin cautiously, their rifles held ready. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, and something else, something metallic, something acrid. As they neared the cabin, they heard voices, muffled and indistinct. Colt motioned for Loretta to stay behind him, and they crept closer, their movements silent, their senses on high alert. They peered through a window, their eyes widening in horror. Inside the cabin, several figures were gathered around a table, and standing over them, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, was Judge Thompson. He was holding a gun, his expression menacing. And tied to chairs, their faces bruised and bloodied, were Mrs. Henderson and Sheriff Bell. Loretta gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They had been captured. Betrayed. Colt's grip tightened on his rifle, his face a mask of fury. He was about to burst into the cabin, guns blazing, but Loretta stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "We need a plan. We can't just rush in there. They'll kill them." They had reached a crossroads, a point of no return. Their choices were limited, their options dangerous. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy who had anticipated their every move. Loretta looked at Colt, and he looked back at her, and she knew. There was only one path forward. It was a desperate dance at the precipice of a decision neither of them wanted to make. But they had to make it. Together. Chapter 13. Reckoning at Dawn. Loretta and Colt crouched in the shadows, the cabin a beacon of menace in the gathering darkness. The sight of Mrs. Henderson and Sheriff Bell, bound and helpless, fueled a cold rage within Loretta. Thompson had outmaneuvered them, anticipating their every move. The realization stung, a bitter taste of defeat mixed with the ever-present threat of danger. "We need a diversion," Loretta whispered, her mind racing, analyzing the situation, searching for any advantage, any weakness. "Something to draw them out. Give us a chance to get to Belle and Mrs. Henderson." Colt nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "The horses. If we can spook them, create some chaos, it might give us an opening." It was a risky plan, relying on split-second timing and a healthy dose of luck. But they were out of options. A frontal assault was suicide. They had to be smart, cunning, and above all, fast. They crept towards the horses, tethered a short distance from the cabin. Colt carefully untied two of the animals, whispering soothing words, trying to calm their fear. Then, with a sharp slap on their rumps, he sent them galloping away into the darkness, their hooves thundering against the ground. The commotion inside the cabin was immediate. Shouts, curses, the scraping of chairs. Several of Thompson's men rushed out, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness, trying to locate the source of the disturbance.
"Now,"
Colt hissed. They burst from their hiding place, sprinting towards the cabin, their rifles ready. Loretta focused on the door, her heart pounding in her chest, her injured arm throbbing with pain. Colt kicked the door open, the wood splintering and cracking. They charged inside, the scene unfolding in a chaotic blur. Thompson, startled by their sudden appearance, whirled around, his gun raising. Belle and Mrs. Henderson, their eyes wide with surprise and hope, struggled against their bonds. "Loretta," Thompson snarled, his face contorted with rage. "You persistent little—" He didn't finish the sentence. Colt fired, his shot hitting Thompson in the shoulder, spinning him around. The judge dropped his gun, clutching his wound, his face contorted with pain. Loretta rushed towards Belle and Mrs. Henderson, pulling out her knife, slicing through the ropes that bound them. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice urgent. Belle nodded, his face grim. "We're fine. Thanks to you." Mrs. Henderson, her eyes filled with tears, gasped, "Oh, Sheriff, you saved us." Meanwhile, Colt engaged the remaining men, a fierce gun battle erupting in the confined space of the cabin. Bullets whizzed past, shattering glass, splintering wood, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Loretta, Belle, and Mrs. Henderson took cover behind an overturned table, the wood providing a meager shield against the flying bullets. Loretta joined the fight, her peacemaker blazing, her shots precise and deadly. One by one, Thompson's men fell, their bodies slumping to the floor. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Colt's skill with a rifle, combined with Loretta's determination and Belle's experience, proved too much for the remaining outlaws. Finally, the only ones left standing were Loretta, Colt, Belle, and Mrs. Henderson. Thompson lay on the floor, groaning in pain, his shoulder bleeding profusely. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth, the heavy breathing of the survivors, and the whimpering of the wounded judge. Loretta stood over Thompson, her gun pointed at his head, her face a mask of cold fury. "It's over, Thompson," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're finished." Thompson looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, fear, and defiance. "You can't win, Loretta," he gasped. "The law, it's on my side." Loretta shook her head. "The law isn't about power, Thompson. It's about justice. And justice is coming for you." Belle stepped forward, his face grim. "You're under arrest, Thompson, for conspiracy, murder, and a whole host of other crimes." He reached down, roughly pulling Thompson to his feet, ignoring his cries of pain. He handcuffed him, the metal clicking shut, a sound of finality, of retribution. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold, they emerged from the cabin, the scene a tableau of victory and aftermath. Thompson, bound and defeated, was loaded onto a horse. Mrs. Henderson, shaken but unharmed, was helped onto another. Loretta looked at Colt, his face etched with weariness, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else, something deeper, something that mirrored the emotions swirling within her own heart.
What now?
She asked, her voice soft. Colt met her gaze. Now, we take him back to redemption. We expose his crimes, clear my name, and restore justice to this town. He paused, his eyes searching hers. And then we see what the future holds.
For us.
His words hung in the air, a promise, a question, a hope. Loretta didn't answer, but she reached out, her hand gently touching his. It was a silent acknowledgement, a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of adversity. They mounted their horses, and as the sun rose, casting its golden rays across the landscape, they rode towards redemption, a reckoning at dawn, a new beginning, a future uncertain, but filled with a fragile, tentative hope. The final confrontation was looming, but for now, they had this moment, this shared victory, this unspoken promise. Chapter 14. Echoes of Gunfire. The ride back to redemption was filled with a tense anticipation. They knew Miller wouldn't be taken by surprise again. He would be waiting, prepared, his men mobilized. The town would be a battleground, a final showdown between the forces of law and corruption. As they approached the outskirts of redemption, they saw signs of the impending conflict. The streets were deserted, the buildings shuttered and silent. An eerie quiet hung over the town, a stark contrast to the usual hustle and bustle of daily life. They know we're coming, Bell said, his voice grim. They're waiting for us. Colt nodded, his eyes scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, the windows. We need to be careful. They'll have snipers, ambushes, traps. We can't just ride in there blindly. They decided to split up, approaching the town from different directions, hoping to draw Miller's men out, to disrupt their plans. Bell and Mrs. Henderson would head towards the sheriff's office, securing the building and preparing for a siege. Colt and Loretta would circle around, approaching from the south, trying to flank Miller's forces. It was a risky strategy, but it was their best chance. They couldn't afford a direct confrontation, a prolonged shootout in the streets. They needed to be swift, decisive, and strategic. As Loretta and Colt rode towards the southern edge of town, they heard the first shots, distant and muffled, but unmistakable. The battle had begun. They dismounted, tying their horses to a cluster of trees, and proceeded on foot, using the buildings and alleyways for cover. They moved slowly, cautiously, their senses on high alert. They saw movement on a rooftop, a glint of metal, a figure silhouetted against the sky. A sniper. Colt raised his rifle, aimed and fired. The shot echoed through the silent streets, and the figure on the rooftop crumpled and fell. They continued to advance, their movements synchronized, their communication silent and efficient. They were a team, honed by shared danger, by mutual trust, by a growing bond that transcended the boundaries of law and outlaw. They reached the main street, the heart of redemption. The scene that unfolded before them was chaotic and terrifying. Gunfire erupted from all directions, bullets whizzing past, ricocheting off buildings, kicking up dust and debris. Men shouted, cursed, screamed in pain. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and fear. Miller's men, a ragtag army of outlaws and hired guns, were entrenched in the saloon, the general store, and other buildings, firing at anyone who approached. Bell and his small group of deputies were holed up in the sheriff's office, returning fire, trying to hold their ground. Loretta and Colt joined the fray, their rifles blazing, their movements precise and deadly. They fought their way towards the sheriff's office, taking cover behind wagons, barrels, and overturned furniture. Loretta saw a familiar figure, a man with a cruel sneer and a scar on his face. One of Miller's men that got away previously. He was aiming his rifle at Bell, who was exposed in a window of the sheriff's office. Loretta raised her own rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot hit the man in the chest, sending him sprawling backwards. She continued to fight, her injured arm throbbing, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. She was driven by a fierce determination, a righteous anger, a desire to reclaim her town, to restore justice, to avenge the wrongs that had been committed. She saw Colt fighting beside her, his face grim, his eyes blazing. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of fury, his rifle a deadly extension of his will. They reached the sheriff's office, joining Bell and his deputies. The building was under siege, bullets smashing through the windows, splintering the wood, peppering the walls. "We need to get Miller," Bell shouted over the din of gunfire. "He's in the saloon. He's the key to all of this."
Colt nodded.
"Loretta, you and Bell hold this position. I'll go after Miller." Loretta didn't like the plan. She didn't want Colt to go alone. It was too dangerous.
But she knew he was right.
He was the best chance they had to take down Miller, to end this battle. "Be careful, Colt," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and concern. He met her gaze, his eyes holding a warmth, a tenderness, that sent a shiver through her. "I will. You too, Sheriff." He slipped out of the sheriff's office, disappearing into the chaos of the battle, heading towards the saloon. Loretta and Bell continued to fight, defending the sheriff's office, holding off Miller's men. The gunfire was relentless, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Suddenly, a series of explosions rocked the town, shaking the buildings, shattering windows, sending debris flying. Loretta looked out the window, her eyes widening in horror. The saloon was in flames, a raging inferno, the fire consuming the building, reaching towards the sky.
Colt.
He was in there. He had gone after Miller, and now the saloon was burning. Loretta felt a surge of panic, a wave of despair. She had to get to him. She had to save him. She turned to Belle, her eyes filled with tears. "I have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "I have to find him." Belle nodded, his face grim.
"Go.
"I'll cover you." Loretta stepped out of the sheriff's office, into the chaos of the burning town. She had to find Colt, among all the fire, smoke, and echoes of gunfire. She didn't know what she'd do if she was too late. Chapter 15. Between Law and Love. Loretta ran towards the burning saloon, the heat intense, the smoke stinging her eyes, making it difficult to breathe. The flames roared, consuming the wooden structure, sending embers swirling into the sky. The scene was a vision of hell, a fiery apocalypse in the heart of redemption. She ignored the danger, the bullets still flying, the shouts and screams of the combatants. Her only focus was Colt. She had to find him, had to know if he was alive. She reached the saloon, the heat scorching her face, forcing her to shield her eyes. She peered through the flames, searching for any sign of him, her heart pounding in her chest, her throat tight with fear.
"Colt,"
she shouted, her voice hoarse, lost in the roar of the fire.
"Colt,
where are you?" No answer. She circled the building, dodging falling debris, leaping over burning timbers, her eyes desperately scanning the inferno. She saw bodies, twisted and charred, victims of the fire, but none of them were Colt. Then she saw him. He was emerging from a side entrance, his clothes singed, his face blackened with soot, but he was alive. He was carrying something, a limp form, cradled in his arms. Loretta ran towards him, her heart leaping with relief.
"Colt."
He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw her. He stumbled towards her, his legs weak, his body exhausted. "Loretta," he gasped, his voice hoarse. I got him." He lowered the form he was carrying to the ground. It was Miller, unconscious, his face bruised and bloodied, but alive. Loretta knelt beside him, checking his pulse, confirming that he was still breathing. She looked up at Colt, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and awe. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling. "You captured him." Colt nodded, his body swaying, his strength failing. He collapsed to his knees, his head falling forward, his breathing ragged. Loretta caught him, supporting his weight, her arms wrapping around him.
"Colt,
are you all right?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with a flicker of triumph. I think so," he gasped. "Just need a moment." They sat there, on the ground, amidst the chaos of the burning town, the battle still raging around them, but for a moment, they were in their own world, a bubble of intimacy, of shared survival, of unspoken love. Loretta gently touched his face, wiping away the soot and grime, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his body relaxing against hers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "For everything." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "I told you, Loretta," he said, his voice soft, but filled with conviction. "I'd never leave you. Not ever again." Their lips met, a tentative touch at first, then deepening into a passionate kiss, a fusion of relief, gratitude, and a love that had endured years of separation, of doubt, of betrayal. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a promise of a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Sheriff Bell and several deputies ran towards them, their faces etched with concern. "Loretta."
Colt.
"Are you all right?" Bell shouted, his voice filled with relief. They broke apart, their faces flushed, their hearts still pounding. Loretta nodded, her hand still holding Colt's. "We're fine, Bell. We got Miller. He's alive, but unconscious." Bell and his deputies secured Miller, handcuffing him, preparing to transport him to the sheriff's office. The battle was winding down, the remaining members of Miller's gang surrendering or fleeing. The fire in the saloon was still raging, but it was contained, no longer a threat to the rest of the town. As the smoke cleared and the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the ravaged town, Loretta and Colt stood together, their hands clasped, their eyes locked. They had survived. They had won. They had reclaimed redemption. But their journey was far from over. Miller had to be brought to justice. Colt's name had to be cleared. The wounds of the past had to be healed. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, bound by law, by love, by a shared destiny. Loretta, still in her sheriff's uniform, stood tall and proud, the badge on her chest gleaming in the sunlight. Colt, the renegade, the outlaw, stood beside her, his hand in hers, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the boundaries of a law. They were an unlikely pair, a sheriff and a wanted man, but they were united by a force stronger than any law, a love that had been tested by fire, a love that had emerged stronger, more resilient, more enduring. The lines were blurred, the future was unknown, but in that one shared look, they had found a truth that extended to the horizon. Chapter 16. The Long Ride Home. With Miller secured and the remnants of his gang scattered, a fragile peace settled over redemption. The fires were extinguished, the wounded tended to, and the dead mourned. The town, scarred and battered, began the slow process of healing, of rebuilding, of reclaiming its future. Loretta, Colt, and Bell, along with a handful of deputies and the captured Miller, prepared to leave redemption. They were heading to Silver Creek, where Miller would be formally charged and tried, and where Colt's case would be reopened, the evidence from the ledger presented to clear his name. It was a bittersweet departure. Loretta was leaving behind the town she had sworn to protect, the town that had been her home, her life, her burden. But she was also leaving behind the shadows of the past, the weight of her father's legacy, the pain of Colt's betrayal. She was embarking on a new journey, a journey towards justice, towards redemption, towards a future she had never dared to dream of. As they rode out of town, the residents of Redemption lined the streets, their faces a mixture of relief, gratitude, and hope. They cheered, waved, and called out their thanks, their voices a chorus of appreciation for the woman who had saved them, the man who had fought beside her, and the lawman who had stood by them. Mrs. Henderson, her eyes twinkling, waved a handkerchief, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Godspeed, Sheriff. And you too, Mr. Dawson. Bring us back some justice." Loretta smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She had done her duty. She had protected her town. She had found her peace. The ride to Silver Creek was long and arduous, but it was filled with a sense of purpose, a shared commitment to seeing justice served. They traveled slowly, cautiously, aware that they were still targets, that Miller's allies might still be out there, plotting revenge. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, but there was a comfortable silence between them, a shared understanding that transcended words. Loretta found herself stealing glances at Colt, studying his profile, the way he sat his horse, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, ever vigilant. She couldn't deny the feelings she had for him, the love that had blossomed amidst the chaos and violence, the connection that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. But she was also aware of the challenges they faced. He was still a wanted man, his name still tarnished by the accusations of the past. She was a sheriff, sworn to uphold the law, a law that had once condemned him. As they rode, Loretta began to formulate a plan, a way to clear Colt's name, to present the evidence from the ledger in a way that would be undeniable, irrefutable. She would need Belle's help and the cooperation of the Silver Creek authorities, but she was confident that they could succeed. They reached Silver Creek, a bustling town, larger and more prosperous than Redemption. Sheriff Bell was greeted with respect and admiration, his reputation as a fair and honest lawman preceding him. He immediately set about arranging for Miller's incarceration and trial, and for a hearing to review Colt's case. Loretta and Colt were housed in a small, comfortable hotel, under the watchful eye of Bell's deputies. They were safe, for now, but the tension remained, the uncertainty of the future hanging over them. That evening, Loretta and Colt sat together in the hotel's quiet parlor, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. They had spoken little since their arrival, the weight of the impending legal proceedings casting a shadow over their newfound intimacy. Loretta broke the silence, her voice soft, but filled with determination. Colt, I've been thinking. We need to present the evidence from the ledger in a way that leaves no room for doubt. We need to show how Miller and Thompson framed you, how they manipulated the evidence, how they controlled the witnesses. Colt nodded, his eyes meeting hers. I know, but it won't be easy. Thompson was a master of deception. He covered his tracks well. Loretta outlined her plan, explaining how she would present the ledger, page by page, detailing the transactions, the payments, the names, connecting the dots, revealing the intricate web of corruption that had ensnared them all.
We'll need witnesses, she said.
People who can corroborate the ledger's entries, people who can testify to Miller and Thompson's actions.
Colt thought for a moment.
There's old man Hemmings, the former bank teller. He was there the night of the robbery. He always suspected something wasn't right, but he was too afraid to speak up. And there's Sarah Jenkins, the widow of one of the ranchers Miller swindled. She might have some information. They spent the rest of the evening discussing their strategy, gathering names, piecing together the evidence, preparing for the legal battle that lay ahead. It was a daunting task, but they were united in their purpose, their determination fueled by a shared desire for justice, for redemption, for a future free from the shadows of the past. As they talked, the distance between them seemed to shrink, the barriers of law and outlaw fading away, replaced by a growing intimacy, a deepening connection. They were no longer just a sheriff and a wanted man, they were two souls, bound by a shared experience, by a mutual respect, by a love that had blossomed amidst the thorns of adversity. Finally, as the fire died down and the room grew quiet, Colt reached out, his hand gently touching Loretta's. His touch sent a shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her chest. Loretta, he said, his voice low, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. Whatever happens, I want you to know I've never stopped loving you. Loretta's heart swelled with emotion, her eyes welling up with tears. She leaned forward, her lips meeting his, a kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment, their love. It was a kiss that transcended the law, the past, the uncertainty of the future. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of redemption, of a new beginning. As they embraced, the long ride home felt less like a journey and more like a destination, a promise kept. Chapter 17. A Promise in the Dust. The hearing to review Colt's case was held in the Silver Creek Courthouse, a grand, imposing building that symbolized the weight of the law, the power of justice. The courtroom was packed, filled with curious onlookers, concerned citizens, and representatives of the law from across the territory. The air was thick with anticipation, with tension, with the unspoken question that hung heavy in the air. Would justice prevail? Loretta, dressed in her sheriff's uniform, stood beside Colt, his hand clasped in hers. He was dressed in a simple, clean shirt and trousers, his appearance a stark contrast to the rugged outlaw image he had carried for so long. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the courtroom, his jaw tight, but his grip on Loretta's hand was firm, a silent reassurance, a shared strength. Sheriff Bell, acting as Colt's advocate, presented the case, his voice clear and resonant, his arguments compelling and irrefutable. He outlined the events of 15 years ago, the robbery, the murder of the deputy, the accusations against Colt, the flight from justice. Then he presented the ledger. He opened the worn, leather-bound book, displaying its pages to the court, detailing the transactions, the payments, the names, revealing the intricate web of corruption that had ensnared redemption. He showed how Miller and Thompson had manipulated the evidence, how they had framed Colt, how they had used their power and influence to control the narrative, to silence the truth. Loretta took the stand, testifying to her own experiences, her initial belief in Colt's guilt, her subsequent discovery of the truth, her perilous journey to uncover the evidence, her unwavering commitment to seeing justice served. She spoke with passion, with conviction, with the authority of a lawwoman who had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of corruption. She presented the witnesses, Old Man Hemmings, the former bank teller, who testified to his suspicions about the robbery, his fear of speaking out, his relief at finally being able to tell the truth. She presented Sarah Jenkins, the widow of the swindled rancher, who spoke of Miller's ruthlessness, his greed, his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony compelling, the truth undeniable. The courtroom was silent, captivated by the unfolding drama, by the revelation of a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power. Finally, after hours of testimony, of arguments, of deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. Colt Dawson, he said, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. The charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are a free man. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a burst of applause, of cheers, of relief. Colt's name had been cleared. Justice had prevailed. Loretta turned to Colt, her eyes filled with tears of joy, of relief, of love. He met her gaze, his own eyes shining with emotion. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. We did it, Loretta, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. We did it. They embraced, oblivious to the cheers and applause around them, lost in their own world, a world of shared victory, of vindication, of a future finally free from the shadows of the past. After the hearing, as they stood outside the courthouse, bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight, Colt turned to Loretta, his eyes searching hers. What now, Sheriff? He asked, his voice soft, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Loretta smiled back, her heart overflowing with love, with hope, with a sense of profound peace. Now we go home, Colt. We rebuild. We create a new future. Together. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, a silent promise, a binding commitment. They mounted their horses, and as they rode away from Silver Creek, leaving behind the courthouse, the crowds, the legal proceedings, they knew that their journey was far from over. They had to return to redemption, to face the challenges of rebuilding a town shattered by corruption and violence. They had to help the residents heal, to restore their faith in the law, to create a community where justice and fairness prevailed. But they were not alone. They had each other. They had their love, their shared commitment, their unwavering belief in a better future. As they rode, the vast expanse of the landscape stretching out before them, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange, red, and purple, Loretta felt a sense of profound peace, of contentment, of belonging. She was no longer just Sheriff Loretta Boone, the woman who had carried the burden of her father's legacy, the woman who had upheld the law in a lawless land. She was Loretta, a woman in love, a woman with a future, a woman who had found her redemption, not in the badge she wore, but in the man who rode beside her. And Colt, no longer the renegade, the outlaw, the man haunted by the shadows of his past, was simply Colt, a man free from the accusations that had defined him, a man ready to embrace a new life, a new beginning, a new love. They rode in silence, their hands clasped, their hearts united, their destinies intertwined. The dust swirled around them, the wind whispered through the trees, and the setting sun cast a golden glow over their path, a promise in the dust, a hope on the horizon, a love that would endure forever. It was a promise, not of an easy life, but a life lived together. Chapter 18. Shattered Illusions. The return to redemption was met with a cautious optimism. The townspeople, having lived under the yoke of Miller and Thompson's corruption for so long, were hesitant to fully embrace their newfound freedom. The scars of the past ran deep, and the fear of retribution lingered. Loretta and Colt, with Sheriff Bell's support, immediately set about restoring order and rebuilding trust. They organized town meetings, listening to the concerns of the residents, addressing their grievances, and promising a new era of fairness and justice. They worked tirelessly, establishing a provisional town council, recruiting new deputies, and implementing reforms to ensure transparency and accountability in local government. They also focused on rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the town, repairing the damage caused by the battle, and creating a sense of community and shared purpose. It was a slow, arduous process, but progress was made. Slowly, hesitantly, the people of redemption began to believe in the possibility of a better future. They began to trust their sheriff again, and they began to accept Colt, not as the outlaw he had once been, but as the man who had helped to liberate them. But amidst the progress and the hope, a new threat emerged, a subtle undercurrent of unease that began to chip away at the fragile peace. Whispers began to circulate, rumors of Miller's allies, still at large, plotting revenge. There were reports of suspicious activity, of strangers seen lurking around the outskirts of town, of threats made against Loretta and Colt. Loretta and Colt tried to dismiss the rumors, to focus on the positive changes they were making, but they couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease, the feeling that they were being watched, that danger still lurked in the shadows. One evening, as Loretta and Colt were walking home from a town meeting, they were ambushed. A volley of gunfire erupted from the darkness, bullets whizzing past them, shattering windows, splintering wood. They dove for cover, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They returned fire, their shots echoing through the silent streets, but their attackers were elusive, hidden in the shadows, their positions constantly shifting. It was a brief, intense skirmish, ending as quickly as it had begun. The attackers vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of damage and a lingering sense of fear. Loretta and Colt were unharmed, but the attack was a stark reminder that the fight was far from over. Miller might be in jail, but his influence, his network of corruption, still extended beyond the prison walls. "They're trying to intimidate us," Loretta said, her voice grim, her eyes scanning the darkness. "They want us to give up, to leave redemption." Colt nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "They won't succeed. We're not going anywhere." They increased their security, posting guards around the town, patrolling the streets, and urging the residents to be vigilant. They also intensified their efforts to identify and apprehend Miller's remaining allies, to dismantle his network of corruption once and for all. But the attacks continued, sporadic and unpredictable, targeting not only Loretta and Colt, but also anyone who had supported them, anyone who had spoken out against Miller. The town, once again, was gripped by fear, the fragile peace shattered, the hope for a better future fading. One morning, Loretta awoke to find a note pinned to her door, a crudely written message filled with threats and venom. "You can't stop us, Sheriff," the note read. "We're everywhere. We're watching you. We'll get you. And your renegade boyfriend, too." Loretta felt a chill run down her spine. The threat was real, the danger imminent. They were not safe, not in Redemption, not anywhere. She showed the note to Colt, his face hardening as he read it, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. "We need to find out who's behind this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to stop them before they hurt anyone else." They began to investigate, questioning witnesses, gathering information, piecing together the clues. They discovered that a group of former deputies, loyal to Miller, had gone underground, forming a secret alliance with some of the local ranchers and businessmen who had benefited from Miller's corrupt rule. These men were desperate to regain their power, to restore the old order, to silence Loretta and Colt, to prevent the truth from being fully revealed. The investigation led them to a remote ranch outside of town, a known gathering place for Miller's supporters. They decided to raid the ranch, to apprehend the conspirators, to put an end to the threats once and for all. They assembled a posse, a small group of trusted deputies and loyal townspeople, and rode out to the ranch, under the cover of darkness. As they approached the ranch, they saw lights on in the main house, and heard the sounds of voices, of laughter, of music. The conspirators were gathered, celebrating their plans, confident in their power. Loretta and Colt, leading the posse, surrounded the house, their weapons drawn, their hearts pounding. They were about to face their enemies, to confront the darkness that still threatened to engulf Redemption. Loretta took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, preparing for the battle ahead. She looked at Colt, his face etched with determination, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the torches they carried. The illusion of peace and safety had been shattered. Chapter 19. The Heart's Frontier. Loretta signaled the posse to advance. They moved swiftly and silently, surrounding the ranch house, their weapons trained on the windows and doors. The sounds of revelry from within continued, oblivious to the impending confrontation. "This is the sheriff," Loretta shouted, her voice amplified by the stillness of the night. "We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." The music stopped abruptly. The voices died down. A tense silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the torches and the nervous shuffling of feet inside the house. Then, a voice, rough and defiant, answered from within. "Go to hell, Sheriff. You ain't taking us." Loretta exchanged a look with Colt. They had expected resistance, but the outright defiance confirmed their suspicions. These men were desperate, and they would not go down without a fight. "We have you surrounded," Loretta shouted again. "There's no escape. Come out peacefully, and no one gets hurt." A volley of gunfire erupted from the house, bullets shattering windows, splintering wood, whizzing past the posse. The battle had begun. Loretta and Colt, along with the deputies and townspeople, returned fire, their shots echoing through the night. The ranch house became a fortress, a scene of intense and chaotic violence. Loretta fought with a fierce determination, her injured arm throbbing, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. She was driven by a righteous anger, a desire to protect her town, to defend her people, to secure the future she and Colt had fought so hard to achieve. She saw Colt, fighting beside her, his rifle blazing, his movements precise and deadly. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of fury, his presence a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. They pushed forward, gradually gaining ground, forcing the conspirators back into the house. The fighting was close quarters, brutal and unforgiving. Loretta found herself face to face with one of the former deputies, a man she had once trusted, a man who had betrayed her, betrayed the law, betrayed Redemption. He raised his gun, his eyes filled with hatred, his finger tightening on the trigger. Loretta reacted instinctively, firing her peacemaker, the shot hitting him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, his body still, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Loretta felt a pang of regret, a flicker of sadness for the man he had once been, for the path he had chosen. But she had no time to dwell on it. The battle raged on. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the gunfire subsided. The conspirators, outnumbered and outgunned, began to surrender, throwing down their weapons, emerging from the house with their hands raised. The raid was a success. The threat had been neutralized. Miller's remaining allies had been captured or killed. But the victory came at a cost. Several of the townspeople who had joined the posse were injured, and one of the deputies lay dead, a victim of the violence that had plagued Redemption for so long. Loretta felt a wave of grief, of exhaustion, of despair. The fight for justice, for peace, for a better future, seemed endless, a constant struggle against the forces of darkness. As the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, Loretta stood amidst the wreckage of the ranch house, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gray and pink. Colt approached her, his face etched with weariness, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. "Loretta," he said softly, "are you all right?" She nodded, her voice hoarse.
I'm tired, Colt.
Tired of fighting. Tired of the violence. Tired of the endless struggle. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch, warm and reassuring, sent a shiver through her. "I know," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "But it's almost over. We've won. We've defeated Miller and his allies. We've secured Redemption's future." Loretta looked at him, her eyes searching his. "But at what cost, Colt? How many more lives will be lost? How much more blood will be spilled?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. There were no easy answers, no guarantees of peace, no assurance that the darkness would not return. They stood there, in silence, their hearts heavy, their souls weary. The battle had been won, but the war, the internal struggle, the fight for the heart of redemption continued. Loretta realized that the true frontier was not the vast expanse of the landscape, the rugged mountains, the endless plains. The true frontier was within themselves, within the hearts and minds of the people of Redemption. It was a frontier of hope and despair, of courage and fear, of justice and corruption. And it was a frontier they had to conquer together. The first rays of dawn touched them both, but it revealed not the open plains, but a reflection of their faces, the lines of worry and love etched across their features. They were each other's frontier now. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The aftermath of the raid on the ranch left Loretta grappling with a profound sense of disillusionment. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the loss of life and the persistent threat of lingering corruption. She began to question her role, her purpose, her ability to truly make a difference. She confided in Colt, sharing her doubts, her fears, her weariness. He listened patiently, his presence a source of comfort and strength, but he couldn't offer easy answers or simple solutions. He understood her struggle, having faced his own demons, his own doubts about the future. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Loretta's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, Loretta broke the silence. "Colt," she said, her voice low and troubled. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I can be the sheriff Redemption needs. I'm tired of the fighting, the violence, the constant threat." Colt reached out, taking her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "Loretta, you've been through so much. You've fought so hard. You've sacrificed everything for this town, for these people. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to question things." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. "But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail? What if Redemption falls back into darkness?" He squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "You won't fail, Loretta. You're the strongest woman I know. You have a fire in you, a spirit that can't be broken. And you're not alone. I'm here. We'll face whatever comes together." His words, his unwavering belief in her, gave her a flicker of hope, a renewed sense of determination. But the doubts lingered, the shadows of the past still haunting her. The next day, Loretta received a summons. A formal request from the territorial governor to attend a meeting in Silver Creek. The governor, having heard of Loretta's exploits, of her role in bringing down Miller and Thompson, wanted to commend her, to offer her his support, and to discuss the future of law enforcement in the territory. Loretta was hesitant to go. She was weary of politics, of bureaucracy, of the endless struggle for power. But she knew she couldn't refuse. It was an opportunity to advocate for redemption, to secure resources and support for her town, to ensure that the progress they had made would not be undone. She and Colt rode to Silver Creek together, the journey a somber reflection of the challenges they faced, the uncertainties that lay ahead. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, but their hands remained clasped, a silent connection, a shared commitment. The meeting with the governor was a formal affair, filled with pomp and ceremony. Loretta was lauded for her bravery, her dedication, her unwavering commitment to justice. The governor offered her his congratulations, his support, and a tempting proposition. "Sheriff Boone," he said, his voice booming through the grand hall. "You have demonstrated exceptional leadership, courage, and integrity. You have brought order to a lawless land, and you have restored hope to a community ravaged by corruption. I am deeply impressed." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officials and dignitaries. "Therefore, I am offering you a new position. A position of greater responsibility, of greater influence, of greater power. I am offering you the position of territorial marshal." The offer stunned Loretta. It was a prestigious appointment, a recognition of her abilities, a chance to make a real difference on a larger scale. It was also a temptation, a lure away from redemption, away from the town she had sworn to protect, away from Colt. She hesitated, her mind racing, her heart torn. She looked at Colt, his face unreadable, his eyes searching hers. She knew he wouldn't stand in her way, that he would support whatever decision she made. But she also knew that accepting the position would mean leaving him, leaving redemption, leaving behind the life they had begun to build together. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and addressed the governor. "Governor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am honored by your offer. I am grateful for your recognition of my service. But I must respectfully decline." A murmur of surprise swept through the hall. The governor looked taken aback, his expression a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "May I ask why, Sheriff Boone?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of disapproval. Loretta stood tall, her gaze unwavering, her voice filled with conviction. "My place is in redemption, Governor. My duty is to the people who have entrusted me with their safety, with their future. I have unfinished business there. I have a town to rebuild, a community to heal, a promise to keep." She paused, her gaze shifting to Colt, her eyes filled with a love that transcended the boundaries of law and duty. "And I have a life to build, with the man I love." A hush fell over the hall. The governor, finally understanding the depth of her commitment, nodded slowly. "I understand, Sheriff Boone," he said, his voice softening. "And I respect your decision. You are a true servant of the people, a credit to your profession, and a woman of extraordinary character." As Loretta and Colt rode back to redemption, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the landscape, she felt a sense of profound peace, of contentment, of liberation. She had made her choice. She had chosen love. She had chosen loyalty. She had chosen redemption. She reached out, her hand finding Colt's, their fingers interlacing. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a love that mirrored her own, a love that had endured the trials of the past, a love that would guide them towards the future. They rode in silence, their hearts united, their destinies intertwined. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns and bullets, but a battle of the heart, a choice between duty and desire, between ambition and love. And Loretta had chosen love, choosing the heart's frontier over the vast, uncertain landscape of power and prestige. The setting sun dipped, but it promised not darkness, but an endless dawn together. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of redemption and to the enduring love of Loretta and Colt. They rebuilt the town, brick by brick, heart by heart, transforming it from a haven of corruption and violence into a thriving community, a beacon of hope in the rugged landscape of the Arizona Territory. Loretta continued to serve as sheriff, her badge a symbol of justice, of fairness, of unwavering commitment to the law. But she was no longer just a lawwoman, she was a leader, a mentor, a friend, a wife. She ruled with compassion, with understanding, with a deep empathy for the people she served. Colt, his name forever cleared, his past forgiven, became a rancher, working the land, raising cattle, building a life alongside Loretta. He was no longer the renegade, the outlaw, the man haunted by shadows. He was a husband, a partner, a pillar of the community, a man at peace with himself and with the world. They never forgot the struggles they had endured, the battles they had fought, the losses they had suffered. They honored the memory of those who had fallen, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that their sacrifices had not been in vain. They built a home, a ranch just outside of town, a haven of peace and tranquility, where they could escape the pressures of their public lives, where they could nurture their love, where they could simply be Loretta and Colt, two souls bound by a shared destiny. They raised a family, children who grew up with the values of honesty, integrity, and compassion, children who understood the importance of justice, of fairness, of standing up for what's right. As the years passed, Loretta's hair turned silver, and lines of age etched themselves on her face, but her eyes still held that same spark of fire, that same unwavering determination, that same deep love for Colt. And Colt, his rugged features softened by time, his stormy sky eyes filled with a quiet contentment, still looked at Loretta with the same adoration, the same passion, the same unwavering devotion that he had felt on that fateful day when he had ridden back into her life. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in a breathtaking tapestry of colors, Loretta leaned her head against Colt's shoulder, her hand clasped in his. "Remember that day, Colt," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. "The day you rode into redemption, a wanted man, and turned my world upside down?" Colt smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his arm tightening around her. "How could I forget, Sheriff? It was the day I found my way back to you."